Welcome to this month's GKW safety training meeting. This month we are discussing enclosed and confined space. The enclosed space hazards come out of OSHA 1926 subpart AA. Today we're going to identify what the difference is between an enclosed and a confined space. We're going to anticipate some of the confined spaces you will encounter, how to manage confined space hazards, how to manage trenching hazards. We're going to review, and then there's an exam. Helps me to think about the difference between enclosed and confined by looking at the root meanings. The root meaning of the word enclosed comes from two Latin words. One is en, meaning in, and close, meaning shut. Anytime you are in a space that is shut in with limited openings for entry and exit, any inadequate ventilation, or is not designed for continuous work or occupancy, you are in an enclosed space. I do have to apologize for it taking me so long to get to publishing this month's safety training meeting. On October the 15th, my family received word that my sister-in-law was losing custody of her children, and so we went from having 3 children in the house to having 9. So my house feels like an enclosed space, but my house is designed for continuous occupancy. So even though there are 11 people living in this 1,200 square foot house, it is not an enclosed space. What is a confined space? Once again, the root meanings help me out here. Con meaning with, and fin meaning end. So anytime you're in an enclosed space with something that might end you, you are in a confined space. So an enclosed space with any other hazard becomes a confined space. Some examples of confined spaces you're going to encounter are going to be, for instance, in a lift, where height can create both limited exits and is itself a hazard. Same goes for scaffolding. If you're in a trench, you're dealing with slope hazards. If you're cutting or grinding, silica dust is a hazard. If you are caulking or waterproofing, you have to deal with hazardous materials. If you're with one of those hazards and in an enclosed space, it becomes a confined space. How do we manage confined spaces? Well, don't create one if you don't have to. If you're cutting or grinding and there's limited airflow, take it outside where there's open ventilation. Then you're no longer in an enclosed space and thus not in a confined space. Always have your confined space evaluated by a competent person. Have a space attendant, someone who knows the hazards, someone who can be outside the space and observe you and knows you're in there, and is able to communicate with you, or if need be, to rescuers. Limit the entrance into your confined space. Don't let anybody in a confined space that doesn't know what they're doing. And finally, have an escape plan. Know how you're going to get out should one of the hazards in that space be actuated. Let's switch into a specific kind of confined space hazard we're going to encounter at GKW, which is managing trenching hazards. Part of OSHA's Fatal 4, what they drive by every job site looking for, is these 4. Falls, struck by, electrocutions, and caught between. Trenching hazards fall under caught between. If they are driving by 65 miles an hour and they see one of these hazards, they will stop and investigate immediately. So trenching hazards start anytime there is a trench at least 4 foot deep. Anytime there is anything 4 foot deep, it becomes a trench. Who's responsible for making sure trenches are safe? Could you say, well, I didn't dig the ditch, I'm not responsible for whether it's safe? Well, according to the OSHA multi-employer citation policy, just because you didn't create it, because you're not the GC who controls that space, just because you're not the one who's going to fix it, doesn't mean you're not responsible. We are, in that case, the exposed employer. And as the exposed employer, as your employer telling you to get into a trench, you then are responsible for any trench you get into. You can say, I don't think this trench is safe, I'm not getting into it. What are the hazards of a trench? This picture here is of an individual who was in a trench doing some plumbing, and when it rained, the rain and mud that flooded into the trench did not allow him to be able to escape, and he drowned and was basically buried alive. So what are the hazards? Hazards include cave-ins or collapses, equipment falling into the trench, you yourself falling into the trench, flood or water accumulation, and then there's always hidden hazards, gas lines, electricity lines, buried pipelines, etc. So how do we manage these hazards? Well, first it gets into what the class of material the trench is made out of. If we're talking about limestone, stable rock that is able to remain intact, you can go straight up with your trench. Vertical is okay in that instance. Other than that, there are 3 soil types. There's A soil, B soil, and C soil. A soil is what we have a lot of around here, which is clay. Sticks together pretty well. Type B would be gravel, sand, or silt, and type C is a granular soil, or any soil where water is present. So if it's a type A soil, the slope has to be 3/4 to 1. For every 1 foot dropped, 3/4 over. For type B soil, you're looking at 1 foot drop, 1 foot over. And for type C soil, for every 1 foot drop, you go over 1.5 feet. If there is rain in the forecast, you have to consider your soil to be type C. So let's review. An enclosed space is any time there is limited openings for entry and exit, including inadequate ventilation or one that is not designed for continuous worker occupancy. Confined space is any enclosed space with any additional hazard, be it height, hazardous materials, or silica dust. A competent person is someone who knows the hazards, can anticipate the hazards, and has stop work authority. At GKW, you are considered a competent person. Have a space attendant, someone who knows the hazards, someone who is outside the space and can observe you, someone who is able to communicate with you or with possible rescuers, and someone who can limit the entrance to the confined space. Good to know OSHA's Fatal 4. This is what OSHA's looking for, this is what we should be looking for. Fall hazards, electrocution hazards, struck by or caught between hazards. Trench begins at anything that's 4 foot deep. Sloping standards are type A soil is 3/4 to 1, type B soil is 1 to 1, type C soil is 1.5 to 1. That wraps up this training. There will be an exam. Click on the link below or the link in the notes and take the exam, and that will record your attendance to this GKW safety training meeting.